Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Mark, and I serve as one of the PNAC Professional Development Co-Chairs with my colleague, Sydney Montgomery, who's also here today. We are really excited that you are here and joining us for this webinar about understanding the financial aid award letter. Just a few quick reminders before we hand things over to our guest speaker. We are recording this session, so if you need to dip out early today, if you can't attend the whole thing, this will be recorded and we will be posting that on our website, so you will have access to that later on. If you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll be, after the presentation, we'll have some time to do some Q&A then, so be sure to use that. And again, we're just really excited that y'all are here with us today. Hopefully this is some really good information for you all. But with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. We are joined by Jordan Grant, who currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Student Financial Services at Seattle University. He comes from quite a few years of experience working with recently at Seattle Pacific University and leading their financial aid office as well. So we're really excited that he's here with us today. Jordan, feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you, Kelsey. Good to be with you all this afternoon, this early afternoon, and taking some of your lunchtime, presumably, to be with me and learn a little bit more about financial aid. As Kelsey mentioned, I've been in financial aid for quite some time. I actually started at Seattle U back in 1994. And you know, when you've been in a profession long enough, you don't actually count the years, you just say the year that you start because the math can be too difficult. But anyway, I really enjoy financial aid and serving students, and especially serving them here at Seattle University. We're going to start my presentation really shortly, but as we begin our virtual gathering, I just want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm presenting from a place here at Seattle U that are on the homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, who continue to steward these lands and waters as they have since time immemorial. We recognize as an institution the tribal nations and organizations who actively create, shape, and contribute to our thriving community at Seattle U and beyond. We as an academic community should be, and we're committed to doing our part to engage with and amplify the voices of Native peoples and tribes. And we acknowledge our collective responsibility to advance proper education of Native peoples and tribes, and call for further learning and action to support the Native people of this land. So with that, we're going to get started. And as you hopefully in the right place, we're going to understand the financial aid letter, or is it the financial aid award or offer? Those are going to be some of the things we'll learn this afternoon. Our agenda is we're going to talk a little bit about the award notification process. I'll talk a little bit about what the actual requirements are for financial aid notification, and you might be surprised by them. The important components of a financial aid notice, financial aid letter examples. We'll have opportunity for you to see what you can find. It'll be kind of like a Where's Waldo of the financial aid awards. Some comparison tools for you to look through and maybe do more investigation outside of this webinar talk. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So a little bit of the awarding notification process. I hope that many of you are somewhat aware of this real basic flow of information for college-going students. Essentially, a student applies to schools of their choice. As an aid administrator, I'm really hoping that students are actually applying for the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, at the same time, sometime on or after October 1st, as they apply to their schools. Students then are typically admitted to their schools, let's hope, especially the schools of their choice. And then after admission, a financial aid notification occurs. And that's one probably initial point of confusion for some students, especially first generation students, because some schools will provide on their admissions letter a notice of scholarship eligibility. And it usually is not comprehensive and inclusive of all aid programs a student may be eligible for through the free application for federal student aid. So that need-based aid application and the financial aid notification usually takes place after admission. For some schools, it can take place as early as December or January. That's usually private schools. Some other private schools and public schools, it can be anywhere from March to sometimes as late as beginning of May, believe it or not. So that's the time frame, and if schools or students rather are interested in what their school's timeline is, they should contact them or speak with you all to know that information. So here's a little bit about notification requirements. Lots of words on this particular slide, but it's at least to give you a brief understanding of what schools and aid offices are required to do. There actually is no specific requirement for a financial aid letter or offer. There are a number of different piecemeal regulations that talk about how schools need to notify students of disbursements of these kind of aid or other kind of information, but no real hard fast, this is what an award looks like and this is what it should say. There is guidance, and then recently came out, if anybody wants to do some sleuthing and put on or try on rather a financial aid officer's hat for a little bit, you can go and search around for this general announcement 21-70 and issuing financial aid offers. So that's a guidance. There's also a college scorecard, which many of you may already know about, which students can look at schools and get a number of information about the school's financial aid offering, as well as a lot of other details about the school. There's also something called a college financing plan, which is separate from an aid offer or even the college scorecard, and it's only voluntary. So some schools do this college financing plan, some schools do not. Schools that are part of the VA Principles of Excellence program are required to do the college financing plan, and the VA, the Veterans Affairs Benefits. States are increasingly having a role in financial aid notification requirements. For example, the state of Washington recently passed a law that requires the Washington Student Aid Council, WASAC, to develop clear, consistent definitions and templates for financial aid notifications. COVID put this implementation on the back burner a little bit, but the Washington Student Achievement Council is looking to implement this law sometime next year in 2022. And colleges and universities should be following their home state guidance as applicable. It's just started. Some of the states that you all are in may or may not have applicable rules around this. So we're going to talk a little bit now about important components of a financial aid letter, offer, and so on. We'll unpack that a little bit too. So we're going to talk a little bit about the name of the letter, like what are we really calling it? What is it? What is it not? We'll talk about the cost of attendance and enrollment as it is associated with the financial aid notice. The types and sources of financial aid should also be a strong component in any financial aid offers one receives. Net costs should be relatively clear, and we'll talk about that, what it should look like. Should also include options to pay for net costs, and hopefully, and this is a developing part of financial aid notifications, some level of terminology and next steps. All right, so important components, what's in a name, right? So we've talked about award letters, we talked about offer, we talked about the notification, but here's a few things. The letter is not always inclusive of only awards. So often when students think about awards, they're thinking grants and scholarships and free money, woohoo! But often it also includes work study, loans, and other kind of expected contributions that are not necessarily awards. And also the letter is not always mailed. And the letter is really a financial aid offer. It's an offer of financial assistance that spans the spectrum of financial aid from free money to money that a student borrows on their future earnings or earn. And sometimes this offer is delivered electronically through email or through a student portal as they engage with their school of their choice. So that's one thing to realize, that I'll be calling financial aid awards mostly financial aid offers from this point forward, and you'll start to see that come up quite a bit as offers for next year come up and are available to students beginning in the next few months. So other important components of a financial aid offer are the cost of attendance and enrollment. And the cost of attendance and for good, well-represented offers reflect two different kinds, subsets rather, of cost of attendance: direct costs and indirect costs. The direct costs are part of a cost of attendance are billed by the school. Tuition, fees, room and board if there are students on campus, and books, although that's rare. Sometimes schools have some relationship with the bookstore, which students can choose to have their book costs applied to directly to their student account and have aid for it paid that way. But that, as I mentioned, that's a pretty rare occurrence, but it does happen at times. Indirect costs are not billed by the school and are costs that a student incurs or experiences just by being a student. Transportation, getting to and from campus, getting to their campus job. If they're attending out of state, going back home to be with family in their permanent home. And then there's personal expenses, late night pizza, laundry, clothing, all the other things that come up for personal expenses. And then there's room and board if a student's living off campus or if they're living at home. There's an allowance for that typically for cost of attendance. And books are usually indirect. Students are usually paying for those books and supplies out of their own pocket on their own time, and it's not necessarily billed directly by the school. Most financial aid offers should say something about enrollment. They should say this cost of attendance is based on full-time enrollment or part-time enrollment, or they'll say, hey, all of this aid and everything associated with it is based upon full-time. Somehow that should be mentioned somewhere on a financial aid offer. And if it's applicable, the offer should mention and state, hey, this particular cost of attendance is about in-state students, or this particular cost of attendance is for out-of-state students, which student you are. Sometimes you'll find schools will at least provide links to these costs of attendance, say, hey, our costs of attendance are available on our website. We strongly encourage you to go look and see there. Increasingly, cost of attendance, enrollment, and the delineation of direct or indirect costs should be part of a financial aid offer. Other parts of important components of a financial aid offer are the types and sources. So the aid offer should mention the different types of aid separately and their sources, whether it's the federal government, the institution, the state government, private sources. And it should say, this particular type of aid program and its source is a gift aid, it's a grant or a scholarship. It doesn't require repayment. It should be pretty clear that it is in fact gift aid or a grant or scholarship. This also should be equally clear if something's self-help. The student is helping themselves through borrowing against their future earnings, needs repayment like a loan, or there's earnings required in the middle of the year like work study. A good financial aid offer will also list out the financials by the term, quarter or semester, depending on the calendar of that school. So the student will see their aid by 3 quarters or 2 semesters. Another really critical and important component are net costs. And these are really probably what it gets down to for most students is like, what do I need to pay? So the estimated net cost is the difference between that cost of attendance, if you remember that included direct and indirect costs, and all grants and scholarships. So that's a kind of a nationally understood definition of a net cost. But for students, there could be important to understand the direct and indirect costs, the ones that are billed by the school and ones that are not. Because a student may be a commuter student living really close to campus and their transportation costs are fairly low compared to the overall average of transportation costs for the students. So that indirect cost may not be as real to them, but all students would experience the direct costs. So often students want to know, what is my payment to the school? What's my direct net cost? And really good financial aid offers do a good job of describing that well. Other aid offers say, we've given you information, here's a place for you to go and calculate this net cost for you. We're going to link you to a costs worksheet or a somehow interactive web page that helps you to complete a calculation of what that net cost is. But the aid offer should at least allude to that, or the packet of materials that a student receives around their aid offer should mention how to get at the net costs. Other important components that the aid offer should include are options to pay the net cost. So we saw net cost, our cost of attendance, direct and indirect, minus scholarships and grants. So there's usually a number there. There's some students, that number is 0 or less than 0. But for those students, and most students, they have to pay something. And so that to pay the net cost could be the self-help student aid that I mentioned just a moment ago, loans, student loans, or student work study. One thing to note about work study, on most campuses, the work study doesn't go directly to pay the bill. Students are paid at whatever the payment cycle is for that on campus, usually every other week. And students can use that payment, those earnings, to offset their costs at the school or help pay for some of the indirect costs that are also part of the net cost calculation, such as the transportation and personal expenses. Then most of the time schools will, on the aid offer, will say, here's some other financing options, students, you may be interested in. Parent loans, additional non-federal student loans, or even payment plans that a school may have. Important to note here, it runs the gamut of what schools do around these additional financing options. Some schools package federal Parent Plus loans right up front. So the dollar amount rather on the aid offer looks pretty high. But on a quick look, you'll see that, oh, a big part of this is a parent loan. Other schools will not put the parent loan as part of the offer, but may have it as a comment on the award offer somewhere to say, hey, student, your parents may also borrow X dollars in parent loans. And still some other schools might not have parent loans mentioned like that on the offer at all, and just have a brief statement to say, federal parent loan is available to you. Please go here to learn more about it if you want to explore this option to pay the net cost. The parent loan is pretty hotly debated at times in aid offices and around the country of how to go about doing it. The reason why it's set aside is that it's not actually a guarantee of aid, whereas even a federal student loan through the federal free application for federal student aid, that is guaranteed. With the parent loan, there's a credit check. So schools should be really clear about the requirements for the parent loan if they package it up front for students, and they should be clear even if they don't, and mentioning what those requirements are to access those loans. Other important components, and kind of wrapping up the important components part, are terminology and next steps. Terminology can typically be achieved through embedded a glossary as part of the overall packet of the financial aid offer a student may receive, or a link to a glossary of, hey, go here to look at that. The terminology can be pretty extensive and overwhelming. So it's really a tension that schools often have, like, how much do we put on this aid offer? So it feels so confusing and overwhelming, especially for our first generation students. Yet we need people to know. So there's a balance, like, do we link to a glossary? Do we put the whole thing in there? It is really a tension that schools debate typically annually. There should also be some mention of where to find renewal requirements of certain aid programs. For example, many scholarships require certain GPA a renewal requirement or a expectation to be continually enrolled. And then there's overall financial aid progress that's not necessarily to be met to keep financial aid eligibility. And the offer should at least allude to that and where to go find that on a school's website, what those particular requirements are to have those aid renewed. And really good aid offers really hit at your next steps. Like, okay, you've got your offer, you're interested in the school, it looks like it's doable for you. What happens next? What do you need next? Maybe you need to go and accept the offer, maybe you need to accept the loans, maybe you need to turn in additional documents. Those should all be mentioned in some fashion, either directly on the aid offer or in the overall packet or website portal that a student is experiencing to get at the next steps. All right, so now we get to look at some aid offer examples. So you've heard me talk a little bit about all these different ways in which you can engage with and learn about the offer. So if you're looking at this offer on your screen, think about, maybe you can drop this even in chat if you're thinking about it. Do we know the net price of the cost for this particular aid offer? Is that anywhere reflected? So think about that, take a look at this for a little, see if you can find it anywhere. Because I think if you look and even try to look harder, you're going to find that the net price, I don't know where it is. We see the estimated cost of attendance bolded on top. We see the total aid at the bottom far right, but there's no real calculation. So the student, parents are going to have to sit down and figure out what exactly the net price is. And I guess I will assume my cost of attendance is divided by 2 because there's a fall and spring, and to figure out what my semester net price is. Do we know the total of the grants and scholarships? It looks like they're listed there and they're fairly clearly identified, but I don't see a total of that. Do we know the total of loans? Not really. In work study, kind of, because it's just one fund. So it's kind of like, I kind of know what it is. I have to do math on my own, but at least it's clearly labeled as loan or scholarship. And when will the aid be dispersed? On what cadence? How often will it disperse? One thing we do know is that, oh, I'm going to get a certain amount in fall, and then I'm going to get a certain amount in spring. So you can see how this particular example has some shortcomings. You have to do some work on your own and kind of figure out where exactly the net cost and other important attributes of a decision making for a college related to the aid offer need to be made. All right, another example, and we won't have many of these. Just sit tight. We may have another 20 or so. I'm joking. We only have 4 of these examples. So, but I think they're all illustrative and be helpful. So this one's a pretty decent aid offer. So just orient yourself to a little bit with this one before I address these questions. You can see on this that it's describing gift aid, it's describing self-help, which is great. And it starts then on the second paragraph to really talk about direct costs, what those are, and indirect costs is actually in that second paragraph as well. So that's really helpful. And that helps us see what the total cost of attendance is. It's right there, $47,500 of direct and indirect cost. And we saw the breakdown in the second paragraph just above this part. So how about total gift aid? Oh, you can see that there's been some math been done here for you, because in this section of estimated cost minus gift aid, they actually tell you what the gift aid is. It's $34,000, and you see that it's the same for direct costs as it is for the sum of direct and indirect cost. And so you can see how the unique nature and individual nature of indirect costs come into play to see what a student really would owe. Because the net costs, but the self-help is also $9,300. So you get to see what the other aid is available to students to help offset some of that net cost that you see here, right? So it's in between. So the direct cost, the arrow rather, is in between. The direct cost is the $45,000, which does not include the indirect cost, minus the gift aid, is $11,000 for the year. And that's the difference between those two lines are the direct costs. So fairly decent. It also then shows you that it's a fall-spring distribution of aid, and it's really clear about the gift aid. What it doesn't necessarily do is say that $34,000 of gift aid. When I look down at the award details at the offer of assistance below, I can see grant and scholarship. So I guess I have to assume that that $34,000 is the sum of the deans, university, Pell, and SEOG. So third example. So this one is a little bit more detailed. You can see how each one is just a little unique in how it presents itself. And you'll find that too in schools, how they present these offers may have some very similar numbers they have on there, but presented in different places and engaged with slightly differently. So this one, I'm asking, like, what is the enrollment status? What enrollment status are the costs assuming? So we haven't really seen that in the previous two, right? We've talked about, like, well, these costs of attendance, what enrollment is it reflective of? You probably gathered it pretty quickly, is that the enrollment is full-time. So it's assuming that the student is full-time and that the cost then therefore associated with a full-time enrollment. And here's the big one that when I was engaging with this to talk to you guys this afternoon, it's like, where's the full cost of attendance? You know, we see an estimated bill on the lower half of the details of the numbers, but I did not see the full cost of attendance. So if we look here, that little box that's our total estimated charges which is the bill, which is, as we know, is direct cost. But we know there's these other costs associated with going to school. Where is that? So we have to take that number and we add it to the information here. Oh, there's also non-billed books, supplies, personal, and transportation, but they're just telling us what the books and supplies approximation is, 550 per semester. So we know that per semester, it looks like it's 7,971, or that 15,000 number for the entire year. But then I have to add 550 each semester for books and supplies. And then some other expenses are varying on my habit. Well, what's my habit for my personal habit and transportation? And you can see that now it becomes a real individual head scratcher for some families where the school should have these estimates available somewhere for the student to see. So, there's estimated balance. You see for each semester, it's about 2,000, and for the year, it's 4,000. So is there other possible aid? Yeah, let's start here at the bottom. It does say if you need additional aid, your parent may be eligible to borrow a PLUS loan up to that $6,500. So here's where an example where they're not packaging the PLUS loan as part of the financial aid offer, but they're mentioning it as another option as well as a number. And then it does tell the student to what the next step is for the parent PLUS loan request. So lots of different things, and there's those other like bonus things that you may have noticed on this aid offer. You may have noticed that there is a residency just below the enrollment. So it tells you that it's for a New York state resident. So it's an in-state person. You know that the housing is on campus and that it's for a freshman or undergraduate. So there's really other pieces in here that could be helpful too for a family as they're investigating into the offer and what it all means. So this is our final example, offer number 4. And I'm not going to do this nice little circles and things like that, but I'm just going to lift up questions for you because I think this particular aid offer example is laid out fairly well. Unfortunately, it does come out a little small. I hope you have big screens and you're able to zoom in as much as you can, but we'll go forward and I'll try to walk us through it as best I can. So the cost of attendance is pretty clear. I mean, it's that first block. It tells you what the budget actually is. It gives the direct costs and indirect costs associated with the total expenses. It doesn't necessarily tell you that possibly the personal expenses and travel are indirect costs, but you do have the total cost of attendance listed there. It also really clearly lays out the type and source of aid in the grants and scholarships, right? It's the next block down. It talks about that Stanford's offering this particular scholarship, which is a big whopper of a scholarship, by the way, as well as federal and state sources and outside sources. So it actually says where the aid is coming from and that they are scholarship grants. And it's actually that whole category is scholarship grants and talks about not having to repay it back. So laid out pretty clearly. And then the net cost. It does the math for you. So here's the net cost to you. Total net cost is $3,000. It actually then tells about the loans and self-help, how to pay that $3,000. Based upon the free application of federal student aid, the parent contribution is expected to be 0, but the student responsibility is $3,000 in job earnings, expected job earnings, or just a contribution from the student from maybe the earnings they're bringing to school. And there's also, then it mentions loan programs and how to go about accessing those loan programs. It does next steps, and it talks about this at the very bottom. If you can read that, this award is contingent upon receipt and review of your parents' signed, completed, in this case, 2013 federal income tax return. So this is saying, hey, you got to turn this in, and what we're telling you, it's really contingent upon us getting that and us reviewing it. So this is a fairly decent offer. It's from Stanford, so they may have some resources that help them put this together. Back in the day of 2014, you see this letter noted, the year noted there. And I'm sure their offer letter is even more robust now and hopefully informative for students. So those are examples. I think they're really helpful and illustrative of the differences that students may experience when they go and look. So the question is like, how do you compare these things? How do you, if all these things seem to be at least presented a little bit differently, even if the information is similar, how do you go about comparing them? I have 3 resources listed here for you. There's a lot of resources if you just Google it, but I really wanted to lift up the ones that have some type of reputation in the community. Federal Student Aid Agency, that's studentaid.gov, has tools. It's more of a narrative more than anything else. There's less of a tool, of more of just description for you. But if you go to studentaid.gov, there's a lot of information there. Many of you may have already done this, at least visited that website. But if you search for comparing aid offers, it'll give you lots of good information of how to do that. The National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, NASFA, at nasfa.org, has a very detailed award comparison. If you search for award comparison, it's open to the public, and you can look at that, and it's quite lengthy, but it's very clear. Lots of worksheets you can fill out, a guide for terminology of important information that you may see in the aid offer and what that may mean. So it's pretty detailed. So if you have any students that want to be accountants or go into public policy, this might be a really good tool for them to really dive into it. I found the College Board at collegeboard.org, which many of us have our thoughts about College Board and our own engagement with them, but they do have a good compare aid calculator, which is online and interactive. And if you search for compare aid calculator, it will pop up and you'll be able to click on it and find some ways to interact with it online. You can type in numbers and it will present those comparisons for you. It's really helpful. So those are 3 suggestions I have for you if you're looking at ways to compare. There's also some families do their own spreadsheets and do their own ways to compare, but these are 3 helpful tools that have already been completed for you. All right, so I got some bonus additional advice for you as we're getting close to concluding my prepared remarks. And many of these things my bonus may be things that you guys already know about, but encourage students to meet all deadlines. That's really critical, regardless of what that offer says. The meeting of all deadlines will ensure that students get their aid offer timely, and it includes as much aid as possible for them that they would be eligible to receive. And then for families, you know, I said the time frame in which aid offers could be coming as early as December, all the way in through April. But as much time as they have, they should take time in reviewing each offer. It is really important to sit down and do the math, especially for cost-conscious students, to think about that. And in taking time to review the offer, not only will they see the details, lift themselves out to be able to see what those are, but they also start to investigate the school more. Because even though you may have to borrow at a school, sometimes a school will be a better fit for a student, have a better opportunity for them to graduate, so then they can pay back a loan, versus going to a school that may be cheaper and close by, or whatever the instigation to go to a school that may not be the best fit and may be a deterrent to graduate. And then you may have a smaller amount of debt, but you have some debt and you haven't graduated. So all those things have to come into play. And that college scorecard that I mentioned at the very outset has helpful information to get at things like graduation rates and retention rates and things like that, that schools are doing their best to graduate students. And as students look at awards, they should realize that the highest number is not always the best option. So you can see that some of these stars are small and they pop up. So if you look at them, you can understand that, hey, this big number of an aid offer actually has the Parent Plus loan included in it. Oh, okay, so my parents are expected to borrow $10,000, but if I remove that, now this aid offer looks really similar to a different aid offer that I received from another school. So now, for a cost perspective, it's pretty much the same, because any federally eligible institution can process a federal parent loan for a student, and for a parent, just some choose not to put that up front because of the credit nature and the uncertainty of whether a student will actually get that funding. Other things students ought to do is be thinking about their expected future income. I like that she's just dreaming of her first paycheck coming through. But you know, that's really important as the major that a student's considering going, engineering, medical, whatever those other, or become a teacher or going to social work. Think about that relative to cost, think about that relative to borrowing. And schools should have all these great information for them, for students, to help encourage and think about what a future income will be. And then my final word for you and my prepared remarks is, many of you already know this, is just make sure your students contact school, send them an email, call them, stop by, whatever that be, because the schools that students interested in should be able to answer any question they may have, point them to the information on the website. And if the aid offer isn't clear, be really helpful in walking a student through the aid offer and what it all means. And as many of you kind of already know, that the aid application is just a snapshot in time. It's 2 years ago income. If anything we've experienced in the pandemic is things can change pretty quickly, including our finances. And so each person has a unique special circumstances that they may have experienced. Not everybody, but many have. And that they're special and unique to them. They should contact the school to say, my parents lost their job or have reduced income, or we've had this medical expense, whatever it may be that's impacting the student financially. They should contact the schools that they're interested in and see if a revised aid offer would be available to them after they go through an appeal process to document those special circumstances, so the school has an opportunity to recalculate the aid eligibility. So contact and communication is key. It's key to a lot of things we do, and it's key for students to learn at this early stage in their college careers. And at this point, I'll stop the prepared remarks and we can move into any questions that you may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jordan. I know we had multiple chats from folks saying how helpful the presentation was. Kelsey and I just have a couple questions that we put together that folks asked, so we'll just kind of get started. The first question is, folks want to know if you're comfortable with us sharing this slide deck with participants today.
Yes, that's just fine.
Great. So for those of you that are attending, we'll be sure to send out this slide deck and or post it on the PNACAC website for PNACAC members to view. Kelsey, I know you got the next question.
Yes, so we got a couple questions when you were going over the first example financial aid letter. Someone asked, is Perkins still offered? I'm not sure what that is, but if it's something you know about.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And I could have mentioned that then, but good savvy catch. The award letter example was just to show ways in which some award letters could be presented. And no, the Perkins Loan is no longer available. It has been sunsetted. Many aid offices are still in the throes of collecting old Perkins Loan from previous borrowers, but no new awards are being made from the Perkins Loan program.
Great. Okay, the next question is, when on one of the example letters, there was kind of a statement like computer purchase. So for those types of things that are listed on an estimate, are they saying those are like required things, or are those just things they want you to think about in the estimate?
That's a great question. Typically, if there are things they want you to think about, some schools may have some requirements around computer, but that usually is funded by the school. When they're on estimates for computer purchase, the schools are recommending that that would be a cost that students would experience as a personal expense or even a supply expense coming before they arrive at school. Good question.
Great. Another question that we got was, for a student who has the college-bound scholarship, how will that show up? Kind of same question about Washington State Need Grant.
Yeah, that's a great question. It will show up under the grants and scholarships section of an aid offer, and should be just in that section and be reflective of the eligibility for the student. So for the college-bound student going to a public university in Washington State, it should be that award is really close to, or if not above, the cost of tuition, and the Washington College grant would show up on the grant sections as well. Some schools may separate the grants and scholarships in federal, institutional, and state. Some just do grants and scholarships and list them all, but that's where those funding should be, is in the gift aid, grant, and scholarship section.
Great. Okay, the next question is, after students complete a FAFSA or a WAFSA, is there additional information needed before an award can be determined? And then does this information get sent to students via email or regular mail typically?
Great question. This is somewhat institution specific. So most institutions do not require additional documentation before they present the initial offer to students. So students do the FAFSA or the WASFA, which is the Washington Student Aid application for undocumented students. And usually what schools will get that, the student is admitted and they'll present the aid offer and then list any documents that a student may need to submit at the aid offer. Some schools, depending on their staffing resources, their financial aid resources, may ask for documents before they present the aid offer. You find that mostly with public schools will do that. Most private schools are presenting aid offers just after admission and then asking for the documents at that time. So it's really important to pay attention to what the school is doing. Now, whether schools deliver that through email or letter also depends on the school. However a student is engaging with the admissions office will be a good signal about how that school is going to communicate to the student through the aid office. But to be absolutely clear and know the path forward, it'll be good to contact the aid office and say, hey, how am I going to know about these things? Are you guys sending me an email? Are you going to send me a letter? But it really is, it's institutionally specific.
Thank you. Question that came in, how does the CSS profile application play into the process? Is there a number calculated like the FAFSA or the EFC?
Yeah, good question. For those of you who don't know, the CSS profile is the College Board aid application. It's much more intrusive in questions that it asks rather than the free application for federal student aid. It is also institutional specific, so it's not required. It has its own separate methodology in which schools can use to allocate their institutional resources. So it does have a result, but how schools engage with that is also institutionally specific. And it just gets schools a more well-rounded picture of a financial aid situation of a student. Real quick examples are the FAFSA does not concern itself with home equity, whereas the profile does. That's a really easy example how to see it. And it looks also as interested in other assets and so on that the FAFSA may not be interested in. So schools use the profile, not as many as you may think. In Washington State, I think the profile is pretty much absent in Washington State. It's maybe a school or two. There is a cost to complete the profile. They have come out with a lighter version that has reduced cost. For some students, it's now free, but it is designed for institutional determination of institutional awards.
Great. So the next question is for our families who have experienced a significant change in income as compared to their 2020 taxes, where would they indicate that change? Does it happen after they submit their FAFSA? And is it something that they tell the college specifically?
Yep, good question. And you answered the question, that's correct. So you need to complete the aid application according to the questions that are asked and the base year that it asks. So once the FAFSA is sent to the school and the student's admitted and the aid offer is presented to the student, it may be that aid offer is sufficient. It may be good enough and really helpful for a family. It may not be, and that's a time for the student to inquire with, sorry, they got a little siren action happening right behind me. So you know where I am. Okay. I think we might be done. The family and the student would engage with the school post-admission, post-offer, and describe those special circumstances. Most schools will have some form for a student and family to complete to help guide them what's necessary for a determination of a recalculation of the aid eligibility. And typically there's documentation. So if a student's family lost their job, for example, from 2020, well, the school will likely ask for documentation about that. Please substantiate this job loss. If there's a loss of income, they'll say, give me a latest pay stub. So, schools are required to ask these things, and students and families should not be, although sometimes it's hard not to feel like they're being called out for these things because they're asking. It's actually a requirement for schools to go through this process of verification when a student asks for a recalculation of their eligibility.
Wonderful. Next question here was, when making a decision about which school to attend, how should students and families estimate their cost of attendance and financial aid for their second, third, and fourth years at that college?
Great question. Yeah, it's a couple of different ways. And it all is, again, depends on the institution and what historically they've done. So one, inquire with the school to find out what has been the annual tuition and or fee increases, and maybe even room and board if the student's planning to be on campus all 4 years, what those increases are annually, and then calculate those out. Second is find out the school's renewability requirements, which should be part of the information that a student receives in an aid offer, like, are my scholarships renewable year to year? And if so, do they go up? And most scholarships don't. They're usually set for per year, but some of the need-based grant programs may go up, like the federal Pell grant. You can make assumptions on that based upon what you learned from the school. So you calculate the annual increase from your base year, your start year for the next 3 years. You find information from the school, it's scholarships renewable, that's pretty standard flat. Oh, my Pell grant is this. If I keep the same relative eligibility, it'll go up by a few $100s every year. And then you can start to get a picture of what it looks like in second, third, and fourth year.
Great. So the next question is, they heard of a student who received the Pell Grant, but was asked to pay it back because they didn't complete the semester or the year. Is that correct, that they would be needing to pay it back if they did not complete a semester?
Yeah, it is possible. So there is something called return of Title IV funds, or return of federal funds. So when a student receives federal funds, if they don't complete at least 60% of that semester, then schools are required to do a calculation of how much of that federal aid the student actually earned. And if the student received all of that funding, or at least part of that funding, in their pocket, and so they've received more than they've actually earned, it could be necessary that they repay it. Most schools, or I should say this, many schools return those funds to the federal government and then say, student, now you owe the institution. You don't necessarily owe the federal government, but you owe, for example, Seattle U. We've returned all this money, and so you don't have any problems with the federal government, but that, you got a $500 Pell Grant, but you really only earned $200. You need to pay us $300 to make that good.
This next question refers to the verification process. This person is asking, can students know if they're going to be verified by financial aid? Oftentimes it sounds like for a lot of students who may be selected, especially first gen students, they need guidance and coaching so they don't freak out during the process. Kind of what is your advice for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. First of all, yes. If a student is selected for federal verification, in which they have to supply usually household size information, maybe some income information, if they're selected for that, and the school is aware of that selection at the initial aid offer, that should be communicated through the initial aid offer with some guidance about what those documents actually are that are needed and where to complete them. There are times that subsequent changes to the aid application, whether that's student initiated or other things come through, that the school needs to make updates to the aid offer, that a student could actually be selected for verification post that initial aid offer. And schools will should have a process to notify students when that happens as well. Couple things to note to mitigate the possibility of getting selected for verification. Students completing the IRS data retrieval tool, DRT, will likely minimize the possibility of getting selected for verification. Won't make it all absolutely go away, but it'll minimize it. So that's one way for schools or students and families to manage the possibility of being selected at the very beginning of the process. There is some definite challenges with the barriers related to verification. It is a national conversation with NASFA, the National Association that I mentioned earlier, and with schools. In fact, we're just coming through a year right now, 2021, in which the federal government, at the point in July, waived the verification requirements for the rest of the year. And we're going to start 2022 when they are so far not waiving 2022. So there could be some students that are pretty confused by this going into their second year, that a school is now asking for things that they've never asked, or they didn't ask for in the year before. The schools should have staff that are available to walk students through what they need to do. They should also be really clear in their documentation and their materials that are presented to students of what to complete, when to complete it, and how to complete it. That should be pretty clear. Many schools are moving increasingly to online forms, which really helps students complete things through their phone or tablet or other electronic devices that helps them complete it, and have usually some help associated with that form to make sure that they completely understand what they're doing. But as I mentioned in my last slide, to contact schools are really important if there's any confusion or need for clarity. We'd much rather students get this information correct the first time, not be confused and feel like they have another barrier presented to them.
Great. The next question is, do schools have to put the EFC on the award letter, or is it usually just an idea?
That's a great question. It's just a possibility. It's not, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's not really a federal requirement to do this. In fact, the guidance from the federal government doesn't include the EFC. There's a number of reasons why that is. EFC is really there to help schools determine the aid eligibility of a student. So that informs what aid a student's going to get on the need-based side, financial need-based side of things. And ultimately, a student and family really care about is, well, what is my estimated net cost? And that's where the focus has been federally guiding that. And in fact, I believe looks like the early templates I've seen from the Washington Student Achievement Council are really focused on net cost as well, whereas EFC is less of a important for the aid offer. And in fact, in a couple of years, the expected family contribution will be no more, and there'll be a new name called a Student Aid Index, which is going to be different for all of us. And if you're asking me a lot of questions about that, I will not have very many answers. We're all waiting for federal aid guidance on those things, but that's somewhat indicative of what the EFC has become to mean to people. You could tell somebody your EFC is $6,000 and they'll say, I don't have $6,000 to pay every year. So it really is not so mean much to them. And it really is an index. It really helps schools determine the eligibility for a student for need-based aid programs. And that's what it's moving to, is that Student Aid Index.
Thanks, Jordan. All right. This next question here, I think it sounds like there's been a lot of terms that have been thrown out, or maybe each specific letter has specific terms that they use. Do you have any recommended resources that might be helpful for people to kind of determine the language that's being used in various letters?
Yeah, I'm going to go up a slide or two here, so bear with me. There we go. So in this middle one, the National Association of Student Financial Administrators, this award comparison has a good list of different terms to review. And it's pretty comprehensive, and it's I consider it pretty helpful. So that's a place where I would say you should go. Most schools should also have a glossary on their financial aid website somewhere that mentions the most important terms and their meaning.
Great. Okay, we've got one more question, then just a quick wrap up. But does and how does an outside scholarship impact a financial aid offer?
That's a great question. I could say what my experience is for most schools, but because it's just most schools, students, families, and counselors will need to check in. Generally speaking, an outside scholarship will first go to meet any unmet need a student has. So any difference between that cost of attendance that we saw and all the aid, there's something of unmet need, and typically outside scholarships go to meet that first. If that unmet need is 0, for example, or the scholarship's greater than what that unmet need is, then the school may be required to reduce self-help. So we talked about loans and work study. schools do the most they can, the best they can, to not have that impact students too much. But it could be, if there's other need-based grants on there, this outside scholarship could reduce those. I have heard, but I'm not seen, that some schools consider outside scholarships as part of their institutional offer. So they may reduce their institutional offer by outside scholarships the student is receiving. But I have not actually seen that play out in reality. I've just heard the myths. So that's why it's really important for students and families to check in with their schools for these kind of detailed questions.
Okay, sorry, it looks like there was one other question
Okay.
that just came in that was really general and actually a good question to ask. I'm curious about it too.
Okay.
But somebody here asked, does living off campus change the financial aid offer since the cost of attendance will be lower?
Not usually, right? So the reason why I say not usually is because it's where you're living off campus that makes the big difference, right? So most schools who have residential halls will consider someone living in a residential hall or living in an apartment to have about the same room and board costs. But if you live off campus and you live with a relative, mom and dad, aunt and uncle, where the cost is lower, there is a separate cost of attendance that's lower for living with family. That does not necessarily mean brother, sister, something like that. That's usually means you're sharing, you actually have all those expenses. But if you're with parents, you can expect a lower cost of attendance, which could reduce the student's financial need and could impact some aid eligibility.
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. This was so helpful. I know for both sides of the desk, all sides of the desk, for those of us that do this work. So thank you so very much for your knowledge. I just want to do a quick plug for our next webinar before we wrap up. We have another webinar coming up on December 1st at 2 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We're pairing up with our Diversity, Equity, and Access Chair, Tony Riley from Alaska Pacific, to put on a DEA workshop of sorts. So check out the listserv and newsletter for information about that webinar. We'll be sending out registration shortly. So thank you for those of you that were able to join us today, and check out the next one we've got coming up in a couple of weeks. So I'll let Kelsey wrap it up and go from there.
Awesome. Again, just to echo Sydney, thank you so much for being here, Jordan. I know this was a lot of really great information. I know I learned a lot today as well. So very, very helpful. But thank you again to all of you for taking time out of your lunch hour to attend this session and to learn a little bit more about the financial aid letter. Again, just to remind you all, this session has been recorded. We'll be able to hopefully put that on our website fairly soon, and we'll also get those slides up there as well. But again, thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your Wednesday.